All right, everyone. Why don't we kick this started? I think we've given it enough time for everyone to join. Thanks for joining the webinar today, ensuring user trust and compliance in a CTV environment. Just a couple housekeeping items for the day. Sam and I will be presenting obviously on the topic. If you do have questions, we do have a questions chat. So feel free to ask that, and either myself or Sam will do our best to answer as many of the questions as possible. We'll also have a couple polls that come up as well. Then if there are any other topics that come up, feel free to ask in the chat as well. With that being said, why don't we get started? So just a quick way of introduction. My name is Jeff Wheeler. I'm the Vice President of Product at Didomi. I've been building out CMPs for a little over a decade now. Obviously, Didomi being a French-based CMP, I'm actually living in the U.S. in Salt Lake City. So I'm happy to be here, and let me hand it over to Sam real quick for his introduction.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Morse. I'm a product go-to-market lead here at Google, and I'm focused on matters of regulation and privacy for our ads partners and ads customers. And obviously, that often includes areas of consent and consent management. So happy to be joining the webinar here at Didomi. Thanks, Jeff, and hopefully we can be helpful today.
Cool. Thanks for being here, Sam. So in terms of the agenda today, we're going to cover three main areas, the evolution of CTV and the growing importance in adtech, managing user consent for a CTV ecosystem. This is obviously the Didomi specialty, and then future trends and best practices in CTV advertising. So Sam and I will be, trying to be as conversational as possible. I know everyone doesn't want to live through a death by PowerPoint, but we will be presenting some slides. And like I said, if you do have questions, feel free to ask. So let's just kick into it real quick. So the evolution of CTV and its growing importance in ad tech. So, a little bit about the connected TV device and what Didomi we offer from a solution. Didomi is a consent management platform. We offer solutions in web, mobile, app, and really any other type of environment through various methods, whether native apps or APIs. But today, like I said, we're going to be mostly talking about connected TVs, OTT apps, which are becoming more and more relevant in the space, particularly around personalized advertising. And really kind of the complexity of what we're seeing in the space. So I think where it's really important to start, and again, Sam, if you have anything to add here, please hop in, is like really what we're seeing in terms of consumer trends in the space. What are some of the most important areas that we're seeing, not only in the second half of the year, but going into 2025. What we see here is, where a lot of ad tech spend is going right now. And we've seen a significant increase of spend going towards the CTV streaming environment, on top of the other couple of polls you see here in the space: generative AI, TikTok and social media, e-commerce, consumer privacy, gaming, which you could maybe argue is also falling within that OTT space, and then political and metaverse trends. Some key numbers to kind of keep in mind as we're talking through this. In America right now, we're seeing about 83% of American households are using some type of OTT or CTV device. So connected televisions, you've got your Hulus, the Netflix, YouTube TVs of the world. They're all being heavily used. And we're seeing a downtrend in some other devices that were areas that we've typically seen in the past of, traditional cable systems, satellite systems. In Europe in particular, 46% of all ad views in Europe right now are being accounted through the CTV space. So again, showing a significant change and trend in terms of those. And then last, the money spent on CTV ads, 24.6 billion. And we see this increasing by significant amounts year over year. As we kind of pause on this slide real quick, I do want to just call out the team, the Didomi team has put up a poll. How familiar are you with CTV? If you want to go ahead and fill that out, we can kind of look at that and also answer some questions and some basic comment on that. Next slide we'll hop into here is, what are the main consent and compliant challenges around CTV? This is obviously kind of a new topic, right? CTV has grown so much in the last couple of years, and what are those compliance trends that we see? And I think it's an important topic to for us to kind of to pause here and talk about, right? And I think the first is privacy regulations. 2018, all we really had was GDPR, and some older US laws. Before that, we had e-cookie law, e-cookie privacy, and different things that were impacting it. And obviously since then, we've seen, almost 20 plus states in the US incorporate their own privacy law. We've got, LGPD in Brazil. We've got, Law 27 in Quebec and possible new Canadian regulations. And even beyond that, within GDPR, we've seen each one of the regulators within the space come up with their own recommendations, right? The CNIL in France, for instance, has some recommendations. The ICO has recommendations. The Belgian DBAs will have recommendations that are somewhat different. So it's increasing the challenges, not only for the CTV space, but in this global privacy regulation space. And then what becomes interesting in support of those regulations and compliance challenges are the consent management piece. And this is where I think both Sam and I, want to spend some time is, you've got frameworks that are supporting these regulations. You've got the IAB, the TCF framework. You've got now GPP in the US. And you have things, like consent mode that Google's come out with and different areas of support that they've, Google themselves have tried to incorporate to help the consent space. So Sam, let me pause there real quick. I don't know if you have anything to add, in either one of these first two sections.
Nothing to add quite yet, but feel free to keep going, and I'll jump in if I do.
Sure. Let me just take one pause. We did have a question from Steve. Are the trends US only or wider? I would say from the Denomi experience, it's wider. We obviously see a lot of adoption with TV in the US, but like the one slide it had kind of highlighted, if we go back, to the key numbers here, there is significant ad spend that is changing within Europe. I think and we'll get to this a little bit later. I think what becomes different, particularly between like the US and the EU right now, is some of the proprietary may be the wrong word, but some of the support for devices that are more US specific than EU specific and vice versa. One that comes to mind for me is Roku. It's very, very much more used in the US than it is in Europe. And so it becomes one of the challenges that we'll kind of hop to in a little bit later slide.
Jeff, something to come to mind as far as challenges are concerned. If you want to go back, or I'm happy just to jump in. Something that we've seen we announced our certified CMP requirement, Google, for our web and app partners in early 2023, and we're extending that. And I'll talk about it in a minute to our CTV partners as well. But something we did notice is that for web partners, it was fairly easy to implement a CMP. Easy, all things relative, but relative to our app partners who had a bit more complex to implement a CMP in the app space, right? You have to push out SDK updates, right? There's just a bit more technical challenge involved there. So if you're a CTV partner or you're a CTV publisher and you're looking at implementing a CMP, something I would highly encourage you to do, whether it's for Google's requirement that goes into enforce in 2025, or just generally because you want to implement a CMP, my advice would be give yourself plenty of lead time. It does take a while to implement a CMP. It's unlikely you can just kind of implement one overnight. So again, whether you're thinking about implementing one for Google's requirement or just in general, make sure you're planning well ahead, both kind of for, one, to choose the right CMP for your business, and then two, giving yourself plenty of time to implement it from a technical perspective. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Sam, especially the timing perspective. I think back to even like 2018 when GDPR was coming out and, working for a CMP at the time and having, customers 2 weeks, a week before the launch of GDPR that were just initiating those conversations. I think, and the space obviously has become even more complex. And I think that's a really good segue into this, the next challenge, which is the consent management piece. Obviously you have the privacy regulation part, which if you're choosing the right partner or the right CMP, they're going to help you comply with that. They're going to give you a starting point of, hey, this is how I comply with GDPR or CCPA or Canada. There is still that kind of level of due diligence on our customer's part or on your part to comply to your understanding of the law, which becomes unique. But then in the CTV space, what I think becomes very, very unique around consent management in particular is like the user interface and how you interact with a banner or a notice on CTV, because really easy on a touchscreen phone. You can just go click with your thumbs and fingers, hit accept, hit reject. You can go into the partners you're working with. When you're doing this on a connected TV with a remote, it becomes a challenge. It's not always the most user friendly thing, and it's complex due to those limited user interfaces. So traditional consent flows do become a challenge. The third point on this on the challenges for connected TV and consent is tracking limitations. What we see is, many platforms, being that CTV is still, relatively young in the space, is that there's not traditional or standardized tracking methods. So that, complicates accurate attribution, user profiling, while still trying to respect privacy. Let me hop to the next tab here, or the next screen. And then the last two are data security and transparency. So, protecting sensitive data collected from various sources, like streaming services. It requires, robust encryption and security measures. And when you think about, most, login environments on CTV, you've got things you're putting in, like your personal information, your first name, your last name. You're putting in financial information, usually with credit cards to pay. And so that increases that complexity around security. And then, of course, the transparency. The consumers, especially in Europe, with a little bit more of a mature market in terms of privacy, they need transparency. They want to know how their data is being used. They want to know how their practices are being shared. And where CTV is a little bit less intuitive and how to display that information definitely does become a challenge that we need to address. Let me see here. Let me just take a quick pause here and click on our polls. Looks like we have another poll that came out. Is what is your organization's biggest challenge regarding the use of CTV? So go ahead and let's give you guys a few minutes. Sam and I will come back to that question once you guys have a chance to answer that. We can kind of discuss that in person. So here's an example of how a notice may look on a CTV environment. And you can kind of understand clicking left and right, up and down, digging into multiple layers of who are the vendors you're working with, or the SDKs you're working with. That does become a challenge. So working with the right partners to ensure consent is collected at the right time, or that there's the right flow is really, really important in terms of the CTV space. So I think this kind of segues into the next question is, how has the transition from traditional media to CTV impacted the advertising industry, right? And this becomes really interesting, I think, right? Like targeted advertising in CTV, like with CTV, what becomes unique is you do know your customer a little bit better, because they're always, in most cases, authenticated. We know who they are, right? So there's more precise audience targeting, similar to digital ads, that allows advertisers to reach specific demographics, behaviors, and viewing preferences. There's interactive TV formats. I can tell you, like in my house, we use YouTube TV, and so if there's not like a local advertisement, we'll start to see a targeted ad, or the ability to skip, or even surveys at times that are asking you how your experience goes. And so it becomes a much more personal, which kind of leads to data point 3 of these data-driven insights. Advertisers can with real-time data and analytics measure campaign performance and optimize ways that weren't possible with linear TV. You've got programmatic buying. CTV incorporates ad buying, automating the process and increasing efficiency for advertisers seeking flexible ad placements. And then I think what also becomes really interesting is the changing, being able to change viewership habits, with consumers cutting the cord. They're not always just waiting on a Nielsen rating to come through to say, hey, like how many people watch this, or how many people have done this. Like it's really kind of on the tips of their fingers to have that data and change those viewing habits, change what type of advertisements are being sent to those particular users. Let me see.
Jeff, maybe I can do it. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Based on the result of the poll, one of the polls, if that's fine.
Yep.
The outcome of the poll is the question: what is your organization's biggest challenge regarding the use of CTV? So the top answers, the first answer, the top answer is technical implementation. So that speaks back to what I was kind of mentioning earlier, making sure you give yourself plenty of lead time to figure out how you're going to actually implement a certified CP, a CMP for your business, and then documentation, right? I'm assuming that's really just understanding how CMP operates in a CTV space, really just kind of figuring out educating yourself from day one how to do that. Given that Didomi has a CTV CMP, maybe how does Didomi go about helping partners who are CTV partners who are interested in implementing a CMP, who maybe are starting from zero? What's your approach, and how maybe other people can learn from that a bit?
No, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think the technical implementation becomes really interesting because CTV, more than any other channel that we typically see consent, right? And I would say that there's kind of three main channels of consent that we see at Didomi, and it's web, mobile, and CTV. Obviously, there's multitudes of other channels and ways of gathering consent, but from like this, the most common of those three. And for the most part, with web, it's JavaScript and it's placing a cookie banner and interacting with the tag manager, which becomes very simple. With mobile, the market is really kind of dominated by two big players of the mobile space. That's Apple and Android, right? So you've got, your native SDKs. Where CTV becomes like really challenging is there are so many methods of channels of collecting it. And it's not only from, the difference in TV makers, right? You've got your Samsungs and your Vizios and your LGs on those connected TVs. But then you even get into some of the OTT type devices, like you've got the Netflixes and the Hulus and whatnot, and they may even have their own apps within those environments. And so trying to support, native views on as many platforms as you can, but also supporting web views, which, a lot of platforms are still built on. And then that's where like a partner like Didomi, where we try to come in, we want to support as many of those platforms as possible. We want to have as much parity as possible across our platform. So, if you're, trying to comply web, mobile, and CTV, you have the same experience. And then obviously being able to document that, because you're going to have specialties. There's, people that specialize in Swift, say like on a mobile app, or in like, Java for Android. That same kind of applies to CTV. And then from a real technical point of view, like our main focus has always been, how do we make the experience better? And so, there's methods that we like to really try to push and offer in terms of, what we call cross-device or cross-domain consent, where, like specifically on CTV, do I need to keep asking for the same category of consent if I know the same person is consented on mobile or web, right? If there's a marketing tag or SDK, and that's really where we try to step in and say, hey, here's best practices. Here's our way to support multi-regulation. Here's our way to support all these devices. And then working more from a partnership point of view than just saying, here's some, here, go out and do this, because it is a challenging space, that people struggle with. Okay, let me look at the chat real quick and see if we do have any more questions. Looks like nothing right now. So let's hop into the next tab. How important is transparency within the CTV ecosystem? For building and maintaining user trust. This is a really interesting question as well, because I would actually pull back a little bit and say this is not just a CTV thing. This is just a general consent thing, right? I think you need to look at your audience. If you're going to target an audience, say in a way that their viewing habits, you can also target them differently, maybe in the way that you're asking them for consent. I think one of the big mistakes we've seen in the space in general over the years is let's just throw up a cookie banner and call it good. And as long as it meets, as long as it meets something like a GDPR compliant, we're good. But I think the space has evolved and CTV will catch up quickly. You customize it, make sure it fits within the app, make sure that the messaging for consent makes sense within your space. I can tell you from experience working at Didomi, being an American, with a larger European presence, is the way that you may message an American versus a Canadian versus someone in France or Germany are all different, and even within the European Union. So take those things into consideration to make sure that you're building trust, because again, I think the space has evolved both in Europe and North America, where if you're not offering these types of solutions, you're automatically kind of losing that trust with the consumer. So managing user consent for a CTV ecosystem. We're going to hop into the next couple of slides here, right? And I think the start of that is working with partners like Google, right? Sam and his team and the Google team have done an amazing amount of work to kind of help support this new and upcoming space. You've also got IB, the TCF, that's working on certain things. I think we've got Julie Ford from the DEA and the DEAC that have new programs that are working with CMPs to support the self-regulation, which is still a huge part of here in North America. So let me pause here, and Sam, we can kind of transition over to you to take the next few slides.
Sounds good. Thank you. So as this group may or may not know, I don't know, folks here who are here because they have their CTV publisher and you're looking for a CMP or are curious to learn more about the environment, but you may or may not know that, in the beginning of 2023, Google announced a certified CMP requirement for web and app. Went into effect earlier this year. Lose track of time a little bit, but earlier this year. That's right. And what that requirement pretty much says was, hey, if you're using any of Google's ad products, sell-side ad products, you'd be required to use a TCF CMP that's been certified by Google on traffic and on your site or your app for European traffic, if you want to continue to serve personalized ads. So that was kind of the original announcement that we made last year, and we began enforcing earlier this year. So now we transition to CTV. When we made that announcement, we did not include CTV publishers. They were not required to do the same thing for the CTV environment at the time. The reason we did not include CTV is because at that time, the TCF, IAB TCF, had not published a CTV spec. So there wasn't really kind of a good, reliable way supported by the IAB and the TCF for asking for consent in CTV environment using the TCF specification. That changed earlier this year. They did publish a TCF. The TCF put out a CTV spec. And so now that is supportive in the CTV environment. And that's part of the reason why we've now extended our certified CMP requirement, which was just previously for web and app, to the CTV environment. And just at a very high level, what does that requirement say? It's very similar to the web and app requirement. Beginning, and I'll go over the timeline later, but once we begin enforcing this requirement, if you're a Google advertising partner on the sell side, a CTV partner, to continue to serve personalized ads in Europe, essentially you'll need to use a Google certified CMP. And I'll chat a bit in a moment why we created that requirement and go over the timeline again, but I just wanted to kind of level set. That is what the requirement is, and it is extending to CTV in the very near future. So please jump to the next slide. In fact, I think I can do it. There we go. So this is covering actually what I just chatted a bit about. I'll note that we have our CMP funding choices. It does not support CTV at this time, but there are other third-party non-Google CMPs which have been certified for CTV, Ditto Me being one of them. So if you are a CTV publisher and you're curious, okay, I need to now go look into CTV CMPs, a lot of acronyms there, apologies, but CTV CMPs, pick one that's right for my business. We have a published list of certified CMPs in our help center, and we call out the ones that are certified for the CTV environment. Again, Ditto Me being one of those. So that's, if you're thinking, okay, what are my next steps? That might be one of them, to go look for that list in our Ad Manager, AdSense, or AdMob help centers. Just punch in certified CMP and it'll take you to the list. So that's a bit of background. So why did we create this requirement for CTV? And really, you can think about this more broadly. Why did Google just kind of create a certified CMP requirement in the first place, one which we've extended to CTV because the IAB has built a spec for the TCF for CTV. There are a number of reasons here. The first is evolving user expectations. So generally speaking, right, users are expecting a more private internet experience and one in which they have more control. And generally speaking, Google tries to keep up with user expectations, right? And we felt that evolving our consent requirements and evolving what's kind of required of the partners we work with to require the TCF will help with that user expectation bucket, right? The TCF gives more control to users. They have the ability to opt in or opt out of certain advertising use cases and certain advertising ad tech companies. So we thought this would help kind of evolve our own approach, as well as maintain kind of keep up with evolving user expectations as well. The next reason is transparency. So we've often, we're always kind of been committed to transparency and control in the consent space, and we're always looking at ways to improve that. I mentioned that along with user expectations comes evolving user expectations, comes the need to give users more control. Another thing is more transparency as well, right? Who are kind of what's going on when they go to a site and they consent to something, right? Who are the ad tech players there, and what kind of ad tech use cases are they operating? And we thought that the TCF is a really good way to do that, right? It gives a standard way for the industry to ask for consent and do so in a way that provides transparency uniformly, right? So we thought that this would be a positive change as well. On that note, I'll just jump down to industry standards, right? I'd say that we do believe that industry standards like the TCF are positive, right? We think that broadly speaking, they're positive, right? While nothing is perfect, if kind of the whole industry coalesces around one standard, it provides a consistent experience for all users who are visiting web app or a CTV environment, right? Instead of kind of these different bit consent experiences, there's one unified experience. At least it is consistent across all of the places where they interact with the consent message. And we think that's positive. And then the other thing is we think that it's positive for the industry to have a unified experience because it helps with regulators as well. When regulators are assessing, our approach as an industry to gathering consent, it's a lot more difficult to do so when there are a bunch of different approaches, right? At least, we can't guarantee that they'll approve our approach, but what we can do is if we have unified experiences in industry, we can guarantee that they're looking at, fewer different consent approaches. And if they approve, kind of the one that the industry's coalesced around, then we're all in good shape. So we think it helps with that as well. And then the last bit, kind of piggybacking off that regulator comment, right? Jeff mentioned earlier that, GDPR passed in 2018. We've all been working to comply since 2018, and regulators continue to enforce, they continue to regulate, GDPR continues to evolve. And just because it passed in 2018 doesn't mean it's slowing down anytime soon. So we need to continue to evolve as an industry, keep up with regulators, and ensure that we're evolving our approach as well. And we think that kind of, requiring the TCF, requiring a CMP from our partners is a good way to ensure that we as an industry and our partners are also staying up with kind of the regulatory pace of the movement. So those are some reasons why we created this requirement in the first place, and then moving it to CMP, moving the requirement to CTV as well, reflects just the TCF creating the IAB creating a TCF spec for CTV earlier this year. So now there's a way to operate the TCF within a CTV environment. So a little bit about the timeline. So this is if you are a Google partner using Ad Manager, AdSense, AdMob, you're monetizing your CTV environment with one of those different platforms. This is kind of the timeline you need to keep in mind. So we announced the requirement in February of this year for CTV. So, it's gone a number of months since we've announced it. And when we announced it, we initially said that our enforcement date would be July of this year. So, a few months ago. We got a lot of great feedback from our partners when we initially made that announcement that July 2024 was just too soon. I spoke to, and Jeff spoke to earlier in this webinar, the difficulty and complexity of implementing a CMP in a CTV environment. And we heard a lot of that feedback, and we took it into account, and we extended our CTV enforcement date out to July 2025. So giving CTV partners and publishers more time to pick a CMP, to implement that CMP and work through the complexity of that. All of that comes with a caveat, which is, as I mentioned in the last slide, regulators are active in this space, and requirements around privacy and consent gathering frequently develop. So we're now looking at July 2025 as the enforcement date, but we may need to revisit the extension prior to July 2025 if regulatory indicators require us to do so. So what would, I guess if I were to bottom line this slide, I would say, if you're working with Google, if you're a CTV partner working with Google, and you're thinking about implementing a CTV, right? July 2025 is a current deadline, but I would encourage you to really just work on getting one in place as soon as possible, or work on getting one ready that maybe it can be turned on tomorrow, but the kind of technical and implementation legwork has been done. So I would say, don't wait, work on that now if you haven't already started. Find yourself a CTV CMP, potentially Didomi, and get started on that as soon as possible. And then just a little bit how you should proceed. This is just getting a little bit into the details, but if you're already working with a TCF CMP, a CMP that supports the TCF, right, but and their CTV CMP, but they're not certified with Google, right? I keep saying you need to use a TCF CMP, but again, I want to reiterate, they also need to go through a certification process with Google. Essentially, what we look for in that certification process is that the CMP has implemented the TCF in a way that meets our expectations and that meets the TCF specifications. So the certification process isn't complicated with Google. We're just checking their TCF implementation, essentially. So if you're working with a TCF CMP already, ensure that they reach out to Google and begin the certification process. If you're just working with any CMP, right, who is neither has not adopted the TCF, or they are not Google certified, there aren't as many out there. Maybe actually this is a CMP that you've built yourself, a custom CMP you've built yourself, and that's totally okay. Google supports partners who want to use their own proprietary CMP, but you're going to need to go ahead and adopt the TCF and then get certified with Google. And then if you have no CMP at all, so you're starting from scratch, that's totally okay too. What you want to do is, my recommendation would be go to the list of Google certified CMPs that's in our help center. Start looking at those. Didomi is one of those, right? Google has certified Didomi for web, app, and CTV. You're obviously here at this webinar, so it could be a great place to start. But go look at that list and reach out to CMPs and figure out which one's best for your business. That would be a next step. But again, bottom line it is, if you haven't started already on this, you're working with Google and you're considering implementing a CMP ahead of our deadline, I would suggest getting started on that as soon as possible to avoid any potential disruption to your business. So that's it for me. Jeff, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks, Sam. So future trends and best practices in CTV advertising. So I think Sam will re-highlight, both Sam and I will re-highlight a couple things here, that we've said in the past, and then we'll open up for some questions, right? So familiarize yourself with technical environments and platforms. Just kind of recap what we said earlier was, there are so many channels, so many different places, specifically in the CTV space, where you may need to capture consent. Again, it could be a CTV environment or an OTT environment, and there could be different levels of support. How far back does you support a Samsung TV or an LG TV are all really, really, really important, in terms of what you may do for that. Know the third parties that you're working with. I think that's also really important. Similar to the mobile app space, right? We're not talking about cookies. We're not talking about like tags per se that are dropped. You're working with SDKs that are developed by third parties that may or may not have a privacy focus, or may not even spend time on that. So make sure you know what SDKs you're working with. What are their data collection practices? What are their data sharing practices? And then from there choose what what's the best way for you to implement. Is it going to be a native SDK? Is it going to be a web-based solution? And then choosing a Google certified CMP, especially using any of the Google products. I know Sam, you wanted to probably re-highlight a couple points here as well.
I think that when you're choosing Google certified CMP, right, choose the one that's best for your business, and I think that again, reiterating that the doing so as soon as possible is really important, right? And again, DittoMe could be a great partner for you, but I think Jeff, you covered a lot of the best practices I want to hit, and maybe I'm missing something. Feel free to point it out, but that's kind of it for me.
No, I think the big highlight there that when we actually were prepping for this is don't wait till the last minute.
Yep.
I don't think we can reemphasize that enough. It's a very complex, involved process to get CMP up and working, in whatever environment it is, but in particular CTV.
Yeah, and if you have experience, again, kind of like I said earlier, implementing a CMP for web or even like mobile app, I would say this probably is likely going to be even more complex than that, right? So you may not rely on your experience with those other environments to inform the amount of time you need with CTV. Give yourself plenty of time to familiarize yourself with the implementation process. Obviously, DittoMe will be there to help you if you work with them, other CMPs as well, but still, it's complex, so give yourself plenty of time.
Yeah, for sure. So main needs for the future. Harmonization of the user experience across all platforms. Again, we're coming to a point where I think most companies are no longer just web-based. They're web, mobile, moving now to CTV. So can you share consent across those platforms so you're not creating consent fatigue? To make sure that you're respecting all of the user choice that's coming in from your users. Ease of SDK deployment is also important, right? You don't want something that's overcomplicated. But I think to even go beyond what we said in the last slide with best practices is you don't want someone that's just thinking of CTV as an afterthought. You want to choose and work with someone that is at the forefront of thinking, okay, CTV is the future. There is so much change and direction going towards the CTV space that make sure that the CMP you're working with is dedicated to increasing the experience beyond cookie banners, because it's the industry's past that. And then lastly, how can DittoMe help? Right, we're obviously have been in the space. We solely focus on consent for the exact reason that I just mentioned. It's no longer just about having a cookie banner. The amount of conversations I have on a daily basis of companies that are like, okay, I can no longer build this or maintain this solution myself. The loss of revenue, making sure that consent is honored. And I think one of the things that we didn't necessarily call out specifically on the slide here is, but you also want something to make sure that your internal teams are working together. One of the things I hear quite often, especially around the consent space, is, hey, my marketer is terrified of upsetting the DPO because they don't want to get fined. And that creates some internal friction of maybe not being able to do what you want. So, having a solution that is built for both the marketer and the DPO to make sure that compliance can be honored while still giving you flexibility of targeting the audience the correct way and the proper way to make sure that you're, mitigating as much risk as you can through that, right? So that's through things like compliance records, making sure you've got proof of consent across your platforms. It's making sure you've got flexibility through the SDKs and APIs, not only to offer the right services, but also know how those services, how are the banners, how are your users reacting to the banners? How are they reacting to consent? Do you have a high consent rate? Where are the opportunities outside of that? And then obviously working with someone with a partner, right? Consent is hard. It's difficult. It's changing almost daily. I was kind of chuckling when I saw Sam's little asterisk on the bottom of the slide is, we don't know what the regulators are going to say. And I can tell you in my 10 years of doing this almost quarterly, my roadmap changes because of a regulation change, because of a new framework, because of a new regulation. And so, working with experts that are following the space, that are working with regulators, is critical to make sure that you're keeping up with it. Before I hop to the next slide, I just wanted to do a quick call out. There's a new poll out. What's going on? What's going to be your organization's biggest focus regarding the implementation of CTV? So we'll get to the next slide, and then we'll open up that. We'll answer that poll, and then we'll answer some questions for you as well. And then the last slide here is how can we help? So again, choose a partner that doesn't treat CTV as just something is just, oh, this is in support of, right? CTV needs to be its own thing. It's complicated, it's diverse, and it's ever changing. Obviously, if you're using Google in any way, working with a certified CMP solution, both TCF and Google certified. And then, I think this last one is something really important is, think about that user experience. Consent fatigue is a real thing. Again, I can tell you from an American, every time I go visit our Paris offices, I get off the plane and my phone is just blown up by consent banners, right? So if you can reduce that experience or make that experience more enjoyable, you're going to have much more happy customers and trustworthy customers. So that being said, I don't know, Sam, if you have any last final comments before we open up the poll and answer some questions.
No. Well, there is one question. Actually, I'll just address it because I meant to do it earlier, and I see it as a question in there. So I'm just going to touch on it now regarding the CTV requirement for Google. I did not say this, but I meant to say that this applies currently only to Europe, our CMP requirement rather. So there's no kind of plans to extend it to the US or other jurisdictions. So this applies only to Europe. So I just want to make sure that was clear and folks heard that before we move to any other portion.
Sure. Great. Thanks. Okay. Let's answer a couple questions. It looks like we have a couple. The first one that I see, Victoria, I know you asked this earlier. How do you ensure that the solution is GDPR compliant and that the CCTV advertisement is transparent enough to meet the legal requirements? So that's a great question. It's also a very difficult question to answer. My philosophy with consent is, you obviously want to work with a partner that's going to give you a starting point of compliance, right? So, for instance, our team internally, both product and our engineering, our legal team, we're obviously part of working groups through the IAB. We're partnered with Google, but we also work really closely with a lot of regulators to make sure that our use cases are clear, and that gives us our starting point. But when you're looking at a tool, you also want to make sure that you have flexibility to take the risk that you may or may not want to take, right? Some companies are more risk adverse than others. And so, because of that, the interpretation of the law may differ. So I think making sure that you start with a good starting point of here's the basics of GDPR. I know in France, for instance, that I have to have an accept button and a reject button, and then just go to your layer of the partners and such that you're working on. But make sure that there's also flexibility in terms of, can I change the design? Can I change the wording? And if I do change the wording, am I going to work with a partner that can point me in the right direction? So for instance, the TCF has requirements on how the messaging has to be done on the banner. So, working with experts that work with those groups, I think is the most important place to start with that. And specifically on GDPR becomes interesting for me because it's not just Europe as a whole. It's knowing that, hey, in France, you may have to do something different than Germany, than in Italy, than in the UK because of, different interpretations or what the regulators may see. Let's see. Next question from Steve. I was reading this one earlier. I don't know if either Sam or I will have the best input here, right? But being from the UK, they have TV licenses, which funds the BBC, and their questions around the longevity and charge due to the greater choiceless in the digital space. Actually reached out to one of our UK employees when I saw that question, Steve. He's our head of sales, and his first thing is, well, it's going to go away eventually. They're going to have to adopt and move. In terms of timing, that's probably kind of up to that, but it feels, from his point of view, that was the direction they saw. Maybe it changes a tax in the UK or something along those lines, but there's going to have to be a shift for people that aren't, actively watching, over the air TV anymore. All right. We had another couple questions. Let's look at the poll real quick and see the results of the poll. So, what's going to be your organization's biggest focus regarding the implementation of CTV? It looks like cross-device possibilities, accessibility, native SDK. We're kind of top of mind in Roku. Roku becomes interesting. That's a topic in of itself, right? But maybe a quick question I can post out to someone in the chat if you guys want to answer it is, what about cross-device in particular, is top of mind for you guys? Give the audience a sec to respond to that. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, maybe while they're responding, we can just answer one of the questions. Give them a sandwich for
Sure.
one. Steve asked, are the trends you were talking about earlier, U.S. I guess just kind of consent requirement of trends, or U.S. only, wider, whatever. As I mentioned earlier, that right, our requirement only applies to Europe, Google's requirement. But generally speaking, I think Jeff, you concur, but jump in. We see requirements for consent spreading, globally. Certainly to the U.S., a lot of states now have consent requirements. There's kind of difference between opt in and opt out. They don't look exactly like Europe, but we see kind of consent requirements spreading, all over the globe. And I think right now probably GDPR has been in place since 2018. And Jeff, let me know if you agree or disagree, but really kind of the most active place for new regulations right now is the U.S. probably in North America. And then that trend could change at any given time, right? Like India has recently passed a law and will have consent requirements, or potentially have consent requirements sometime next year, for example, right? So the globe kind of continues to come online, and I think these trends, apply to a lot of different regions.
Yo, no, I would 100% agree or agree there that obviously the U.S. is where we're seeing a lot of movement. What will be interesting just to see if Canada ends up coming up with some type of a national bill. I know last time I talked to a couple of folks up there was a lot of questions about that. Will Brazil do anything? Is kind of the question. But I think especially in the U.S., so California is still kind of leading that charge. So if at some point the CPPA comes up with something specific of CTV, that could be interesting. And I think what we'll end up seeing following, this is just Jeff's personal thought, is right now everything's based in the TCF in Europe. What will be next? Will it be GPP? Will they have some type of CTV framework, or will there be something more US focused? But I think yes, generally what we see is it's a very global approach to privacy, and we see the US catching up quickly. I think what we'll see is kind of like what we saw in Europe. The first couple of years will be mostly web based. A little bit of mobile app based, but with the growing presence of CTV, I don't think it'll be as long as what we may have seen in Europe. All right, I think I saw one of the questions from Antonio. Is HBB TV for broadcasters in your plan? So that's an interesting question. We definitely work specifically with HBB TV. One of my product managers on my team specifically focuses on CTV. That's her whole job, and I know she's actually doing quite a bit of research for that. So long story short, the answer is yes. We plan to support as much for HBB TV, especially in Europe in the coming future and in the coming months and in 2025, because we do see quite a bit of a growth here next little bit. Just kind of going back to the chat, I didn't see anyone specifically call out cross-device, but we've got a few more minutes. I think what's important about cross-device and really what cross-device means and the whole point of it is, we've got a handful of customers, and if you're interested in this, please reach out. I'd love for my pre-sales team to be able to show you guys what we mean by this, but we definitely see that consent fatigue piece around all of consent. And, recreating a new user experience to make sure that consent is asked at the right time, at the right applicable time. It's starting to be a trend that we have seen greatly in the space, and CTV plays a big part of that, I think, especially going back to the limited user experience that you're allowed there. And so, cross-device could be taken in many ways. It could be taken of, like, do I need to ask for marketing for the same person if I know who they are across different platforms, whether it's, web, mobile, or CTV? But it's also maybe the experience is you don't have to ask for consent on the TV. We've got a handful of customers that said, hey, I think it's a better experience for our customers to scan a QR code and be able to have a device that's, consent is done on a mobile app because it's much easier to use your hands on a touchscreen than that. So I think, what I'm trying to get at here is, there's flexibility in what you do there. And as you're thinking about, cross-device, think of it from a user experience, think of it from a regulatory compliant experience, because there's a lot more power than just throwing up a banner and saying, please consent to, these vendors and purposes that we're working with. All right, I am looking through the questions in the chat. If there are no more questions, like to thank everyone for joining, especially Sam. Your time is much appreciated. Your expertise in the space as well. So thank you all for joining. The session will be recorded, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask any questions. And that being said, everyone have a wonderful morning or afternoon wherever you are.
Thank you.